beginning to start. There's a very simple exercise which is you go to create India and the rest of the world. And then there's a little exercise where you say, close the border or lower the trade cost between India and Pakistan. And then you just crank a few equations and you get a number that tells you how much is what are the one thing you pay
So there are yes, how long is it? I think that in terms of the imitation what kind of time
sorry. Faria, can you come here? On this one, I'm not sure which one is correct. It's like the most recent one is this one. Does that sound right? Yeah,
that's definitely something.
Is it the GIZ training? This one here?
Yes, yeah,
okay,
that
brilliant.
would
That's
yeah.
important.
Yeah, thank you.
But again, maybe cross this relate to that. Okay, within the firm, they see again the magnitude of this those things might be.
Okay, so I have them all. So these are all yours. So I'll have them on my own hard drive, so I'll be able to email them to you afterwards. Okay, they're all there, so I'll open them all now. So the first one is this one, yeah, okay.
Chris already told you the one you want.
Yeah, so they're all
I'll
out.
just return these.
Okay, fantastic, thank you.
Yes, or even are because again, I don't think that I don't think we once you know you are no, absolutely, and I think some of those countries
You're most welcome, yes. We have 20 minutes for each presentation. And after that, in your case, we don't have a discussion with
Sure.
your questions, but we'll take questions at the end. And of course, we have nobody asking you questions.
Of course.
Okay, please.
Welcome everyone. My name is Pinar Keskin. I'm a professor of economics at Wesley College in Boston. And this is joint work with one of my colleagues, Kartini Shastri and Helen Willis from Federal Reserve Board. So our motivation is quite simple. Water-related problems are a huge policy concern in many parts of the world. And according to one estimate only, there is approximately 3.5 million people who are losing their lives related to water and sanitation-related issues in developing countries. So even though we know that water use and clean water access is a huge problem, eliciting behavior change remains a huge challenge. So we have many economic studies actually. For instance, there is a wave literature now mostly led by Michael Kramer in Africa, which shows that willingness to pay for clean water is still quite low. And information campaigns which inform people about the quality of their water is still not really have huge impact on people's decision to switch their water sources. So there is evidence on that as well in the literature. And the impact of, in general, the information campaigns on people's behavior about anything, this can be contraceptive use or the HIV-related information campaign, still has mixed evidence about people's behavior. So what we do specifically in our study, we try to figure out whether mothers are changing their breastfeeding behavior, their breastfeeding duration in particular, as a response to the concerns about water quality. And I will explain why we think that this is a relevant concern, especially in an area like Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, millions of people actually face a huge environmental disaster for decades now. So people are actually exposed to arsenic-contaminated drinking water in many parts of the country. And large-scale information campaigns help people to be informed about the quality of their drinking water source. So we will use this information campaign to try to understand whether it has an effect on mothers' behavior. So first of all, why we think that arsenic is a huge problem, you all know, and actually that's, I think, one of the main reasons why arsenic information campaign was so successful in Bangladesh. It's just a scary word. But of course, if you drink a glass of water which has a little bit of arsenic in it, your liver will take care of it. So one time, it won't hurt you. But if you are chronically exposed to arsenic-contaminated water, it starts accumulating in your body. And around 6 months, as the scientific threshold they use, we start to see some symptoms. In the first couple of years, you start to see some skin rashes, irritation, or weakness. But after a while, maybe a decade of drinking arsenic-contaminated water, you start seeing increased risk of skin and other internal organ cancers. And that can be, of course, fatal. And why breastfeeding, we think that is a relevant thing in such an environment where arsenic contamination is a big problem. First of all, there is a huge medical literature which is telling us breastfeeding is very important for infant health and mortality outcomes if you are living in an area where water quality is questionable. So first of all, there's a biological reason that, I'm not an expert to explain that part, but there's a miracle in breast milk which prevents a certain pathogen from attacking your GI tract. So there's a biological evidence on that. But also, if you think just mechanical way of it, that if you give breast milk to your kid, that means that you are not actually exposing the baby in particular to the certain problems about the water quality. And of course, exclusive breastfeeding, which is giving your kid only breast milk, is the main target. And this is what is recommended by World Health Organization as well for years, 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding at least. And you might ask that actually, if mothers are drinking arsenic-contaminated water, how that will protect the kid through breastfeeding? So there is quite robust evidence which shows that even though mother drinks contaminated water with arsenic, there is very low concentration of arsenic, which is almost negligible in the breast milk. So that's actually another thing that we will use in this study. What about the drinking water history of Bangladesh? So Bangladesh is a rare case in terms of, I think, water literature, because it's a place which is both blessed in terms of water, but also is cursed by water sources. So there is a huge history of water-related problem. If you go to 1970s, most households were relying on surface water sources. But of course, that created certain problems because surface water was quite contaminated with other pathogens and which caused diarrheal diseases, especially for children. So there was a huge campaign in the 1970s, which is also funded by some international agencies as well, and people are encouraged to drill millions of tube wells, and they start using groundwater as their main water source. But in 1990s, we start seeing the first symptoms of arsenic poisoning in the country. Even though there were individual cases that actually struck attention from international media as well, and people actually start talking about a major environmental tragedy of humankind. So, and in late 1990s and 2000s, people, both UNICEF and government of Bangladesh, start screening shallow tube wells in the country and start a huge information campaign. What was the campaign about? So basically, with support of UNICEF, government of Bangladesh tested around 4.7 million tube wells in the country. And this test has a very clear signal for the villagers that if the well tested has above 5 micrograms per liter arsenic level, that well was painted red, and that was 1.4 million well approximately painted red. That means you shouldn't drink water. This is slightly above, actually 5 times higher than World Health Organization's suggested arsenic level, but still that's a huge sign. And the safe wells were painted green. And through the information campaign, people are encouraged to use the green wells, not the red one. And people also, while people were testing the wells, they also talked to people about how arsenic contamination is a problem and what kind of health effects it can have. Nothing we know of about breastfeeding during those conversations, especially because most of the well testers were male, and given the structure in Bangladesh, probably it's very hard for a male to talk to a woman about breastfeeding. But the idea is that this has a huge awareness. If we look at Bangladesh Demographic and Health Survey from 2004, we know that 84% of people heard about the problem. So just this number is actually quite huge in a developing country standard, but also there are studies showing that use of contaminated wells fell drastically in this period as a result of the campaign. So what we will do in this study, we will use 2 variations that we can get from Bangladesh. we will actually compare the children which are born right before the campaign and right after the campaign. We use 2002 as our threshold because even though the campaign started in 1999, the first 2.5 years, according to the summary reports of the campaign and the report prepared by World Bank, they were relatively slow, so the kickoff was around 2002. And then we also compare the kids which are actually living in more and less contaminated areas. We have a continuous measure of that, but the idea is that we compare kids who were more exposed to arsenic versus less. And the idea is that information campaign targeted heavily the contaminated areas, so the behavior should be affected on those areas more. And of course, the main problem with identification here is to convince people that arsenic contamination is not really correlated with other observable or unobservable characteristics of the area, which is the case actually, because if you look at the arsenic contamination, it varies quite a bit geographically, and it depends on the soil depth or the geology. So there is no reason to believe us that anything on the top of the surface is really affecting the arsenic contamination levels. And also there is fair amount of local variation. If you look at studies by especially Lex Wangin and Alessandro Terozzi has work about that as well. Most contaminated wells have an uncontaminated well which is almost in the 100-meter distance. So they are very close. And when you look at the data, you see that there is some correlation maybe with some village level variables, not much variation within the village. And of course, throughout the study, I don't want to go technical details, but we control for the village fixed effects and other district-specific trends. So what is the data source we will use? The first data that we use for arsenic contamination comes from British Geological Survey, which is collected right before the campaign. So there's less of an issue about new drilling wells, etc. We have approximately 3,500 wells. And if you look at it, the red ones are the contaminated ones in Bangladesh standards, and the blue ones are the green wells, basically. And we also use data from Bangladesh Demographic Health Surveys from 1999, 2004, and 2007. And we basically look at the children which are born up to 5 years before the survey. So we have two groups of kids. One are not affected by the campaign, the ones born 1995 to 2001, and the ones born 2002 to 2007. And we have approximately 360 clusters or villages in each round of the survey. It's not a panel of the household, but somehow you can get the cluster GPS locations. And the surveys include, of course, lots of questions about demographics, breastfeeding behavior, and child health. And nicely, also not that nicely, we have only data in 2004 from this survey about the arsenic contamination level in the real drinking water of the household. So that data is also collected about as well as awareness. So what we did to calculate our arsenic exposure measure, so we have two separate GPS locations. So we have the GPS location for each well, the red crosses there, and the location of each cluster. So what we did is, one of the preferred measures, we use multiple measures of contamination, but the one that I will show you the results for is the following. So we look at each cluster, and conditional on being at a particular cluster and 5 miles radius of that cluster, we calculate the probability of being within 1 mile of a contaminated well. So it's basically a probability calculation. Of course, we calculated other more simple measures such as number or percentage of wells within 5 miles that are contaminated or the average contamination level. But the nice thing about that, all those contamination measures give us quite highly correlated results. So if you look at the paper, actually there are some results of that. But also this number of contamination is highly correlated with the actual arsenic contamination, which is tested in 2004 by BDHS. So, and also we look at certain summary statistics in 1999 data, which convinces us even more that contaminated and uncontaminated areas were pretty much the same in terms of certain observables. So, what is the first cut of the result? The very first thing that we are interested in is obviously whether kids which were born in contaminated areas after the information campaign are affected or are actually now breastfed longer. So the pulse is a measure of being born after the campaign, contamination is a continuous measure of that probability I just showed you. And what does these numbers mean? First of all, this tells you that if you are born after the campaign in a contaminated area, you are more likely to be breastfed longer. That's a significant difference, and that's particularly true in rural parts of the country, which makes sense because those are the parts which has less access to like higher quality water, like through pipelines, for instance. So what are these numbers mean? If you increase the contamination level from 0% to 10%, that is a 1 standard deviation increase, will increase a mother's breastfeeding duration by 0.6 months. Okay, so that's more or less the numerical equivalent of these results. And with district trends, etc., the results stay quite robust. We repeated this exercise for other breastfeeding outcomes, whether you are breastfed longer than 12 months, whether you are exclusively breastfed. I will talk about it more, but that's the part which has more health implications. And we use different measures of exposure to arsenic, which gave the same results. And also, we are aware of the fact that breastfeeding duration is a right sensor dependent variable. Of course, there can be some kids in our sample which are still breastfeeding, or there can be kids who died during breastfeeding. So actually, we use different specifications which kind of take care of those econometric problems, but those results were initially robust. However, there can still be some concerns about the fact that contaminated villages could be on a different, track, even in the absence of the information campaign. So what we did is we have a triple difference specification, both to actually support our identification assumption about those parallel trends, but also to help to rule out certain mechanisms which are kind of like non-health behavior changes. So what we did is we compare the effect of this campaign for women who has, think about two women who live in contaminated areas, equally contaminated areas, but one has better access to water sources, clean water sources than the other. So we actually use that third difference of accessibility, or the distance or probability of accessing to clean water sources. And the idea is the following: if you live close to a clean well, if you live in a contaminated area and live close to the clean options, then you will switch your water source, because that's the beneficial one for the entire household, not just for your baby that you are trying to protect. And as a result, households who have those options shouldn't change their breastfeeding behavior so much. And those results are actually, first of all, just to make a point about the distance versus water contamination, using 2004 data, here what we try to show is how the probability of living within a 1 mile of an uncontaminated well decreases the chances of using contaminated water in 2004. It's really true that, closer you are to uncontaminated resources, you switch the water source. And also, that effect is mostly coming from, I don't know why you cannot see the dash ones, but the one which is coming from high up to down is when you divide the sample into groups, actually the most of that effect of switching to clean water sources is coming from households which lives in more contaminated clusters and who told us in 2004 that they actually heard about arsenic. So people are actually, the group of people who got the message are the ones who changed their switching behavior at least. So we look at that kind of like triple difference, and what we found is this is for 3 different breastfeeding measures. The first row here is for kids who are born after the campaign in more contaminated areas, and this one is like kids who are born after the campaign in contaminated areas, but who has a higher probability of access to clean water sources. The summary is, yes, actually, the effect is really stronger for women, the women who really change their breastfeeding behavior are the ones who live in contaminated areas and who do not have access to cleaner water sources. So I think that's yes.
This is the measure of distance is inverse to distance.
Exactly, it's inverse. It's the probability of access to clean water. That's true. It's not a distance measure, but rather the opposite. Thank you. Okay, so one might be interested in like actually what are the age range of the kids who are affected by this. So if you look at different age groups this is going back to our definitive double difference, that actually the kids who are significantly affected by the campaign are the kids who are younger. So you are significantly increasing, that is basically saying that you increase the duration of the probability of exclusive breastfeeding increases for a 6 months old baby around 8.5% if you move from 0% contamination to 10% contamination. And older the kid, of course, that effect disappears. And actually we can kind of compare this with the health outcomes result that we get from the data. And interestingly, or maybe not that interesting after you saw the previous result, the probability of dying in the first 6 months of your life, or 12 months, or 24 months of your life, what I'm showing here, the probability of losing your life in the first 6 months of your life is actually going down if you are living in a contaminated area. So that had an effect as well. Also, if you look at other health outcomes like incidence of diarrhea, weight for height outcomes, etc., you see that actually kids born in contaminated areas are better off after the information campaign. So it was kind of an unintended consequence of the campaign, obviously. So is this a behavior change? Do I have 1 minute? How many minutes? 2 minutes. Okay. So was it really a health behavior change? Actually, we really believe so. So what are the alternatives? So the alternative explanation, one can be that actually there can be a productivity shock to the mothers which makes them either to breastfeed more or breastfeed less. So what is that? If you, after the campaign, you switch your water source, you are less exposed to arsenic, so you are healthier, you will breastfeed your kid longer. Actually, my triple difference shows that it's not the case. It is just the opposite. Women who couldn't switch end up breastfeeding more. So it's not that they're getting healthy, so they breastfeed more. The alternative, I cannot show you empirically is not the case, but suggests that actually women breastfeed less as they get healthier because now they're healthy, they can work outside, do other stuff. So that working outside effect is not really there in case of Bangladesh, so we cannot say much. It can be the case that they switch between tasks within the household, like instead of breastfeeding, they take care of their elderly parents, but I mean, as a mother, that doesn't sound like a very reliable thing to me, but again, we don't have an empirical evidence for that. The other alternative might be maybe clean water is more costly, so women who switch wells are breastfeeding less because they need to walk longer. That is not the case. On average, the increase in walking time in a day is 4 to 18 minutes, so that is not reasonable. And finally, one can claim that actually there can be some kind of a contraceptive reason of breastfeeding. Most people in developing countries believe that actually breastfeeding increases the duration between births, so it can be contraceptive, but actually we couldn't find any effect on desired total number of children or actual birth spacing or the desired birth spacing, so there is nothing. So conclusion, this was a very successful campaign. It definitely changed the water source for many households, but also we found that women respond quite strongly by breastfeeding their kid longer, especially in the areas where there is no other healthy option for water sources. And we also have some suggestive evidence of the fewer deaths for those kids which are breastfed longer. And one more thing, this is ongoing project, and this is basically next to, for anyone who has great ideas, I'm here. This particular campaign was a huge puzzle. There are many papers which show that actually it is successfully changed people's health behavior. And this is an impossible case to find anywhere else in the world. That is such a huge change in people's behavior, even though this was a non-costly action. So there are a couple of hypotheses that we work on, but again, the current research agenda is why Bangladesh was so successful to convince people to change their water source. Thank you.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay.
We take questions on paper at the end.
Okay, so thanks for coming. Thanks for including this on the program. I'll start by saying this is joint work with Rocco Machiavello and Andreas Menzel, who's a PhD student at Warwick. This is a project which very much is an IGC project. Well, I don't think at least I'm now spending all of my time working on garments. I wouldn't be doing anything on garments if it weren't for IGC. So we're doing a lot of the work in Bangladesh. We're beginning to do some work in other countries as well. And it was all sort of came about through a set of connections that were facilitated by the IGC. Why are we interested in the garment sector, and why are we interested in particular in garments in Bangladesh? I'll have sort of two slides that give us some motivation for why Rocco and I got interested in this sector. One is Bangladesh. These are data from a couple of years ago. This is export levels, which are now about $25 billion a year. Most of Bangladesh's exports come from the garment sector. Bangladesh is the second largest garments producer in the world behind China. There's a lot of production moving out of China. The industry's been growing quite rapidly. It plays a large role in what's been 7% growth in Bangladesh, growth in GDP per capita over the last 10 to 15 years. And the garment sector and the growth of the garment sector has played a large role in that. It's also played a large role, which I'm still a bit struggling with data to sort of demonstrate in a clear way, in bringing women into the wage labor market and women into the labor force. Second reason that we find the sector interesting is this is actually from the white paper from the firms group at IGC, and it shows the distribution of, too small for you to see, but the distribution of firms by size in a lot of the IGC countries. And Bangladesh is up in the upper left, and notice that in the highest size, the largest size distribution, Bangladesh has an enormous number of firms relative to any other country, any other IGC country. And most of those firms are garments firms. So this is a sector which is really unique among low-income countries. Roughly 5,000 manufacturing companies, most of them with an average size of about 1,000 workers. And almost all of them domestically owned by Bangladeshi. So it really is, in the context of countries at the income level of Bangladesh, a unique sector. So why do we focus? This paper is going to focus on gender. We're going to look at a training program that trains sewing machine operators to become line supervisors. Why are we interested in gender? Well, as I said, the garment sector has been responsible for opening up wage labor markets for women. There's some ILO data. There's also some conflicting ILO data, but there's ILO data that says that the female labor force participation ratio has increased from 22% in 2000 to 34% in 2010. Not all of that is garments, but a lot of that is garments have clearly played a big role in that. The sector now employs about 4 million workers. It accounts for about 12 or 13% of GDP. Of the 4 million workers, about 80% are women. On the other hand, women make up only about 5 to 10% of the supervisory labor force. So they're the large portion of the workforce, but a very small portion of the supervisory labor force. And the questions that we bring to this is why there's this significant gender imbalance between the proportion of operators and proportion of supervisors, and whether the gender imbalance hampers productivity. That is, whether factories are under-promoting women relative to an efficient pattern. And for those of you who saw the presentation I gave yesterday in the trade research group, one of our goals in this project also is to collect very detailed production level data from these factories and try to understand productivity in Bangladesh and other countries in the sector. So why are the ratios so skewed? Well, we can think of several possible reasons. We don't know, but we can think about several possible reasons. We see them as clustered the explanations is clustered around learning and comparative advantage. Maybe there's too little experimentation. Maybe when the sector started, factories promoted men. They learned how to select men to be supervisors. They learned the characteristics that make men good supervisors. Since they didn't promote women, they never learned the characteristics of women that make good supervisors. This is a histogram of the percentage of supervisors in the factories who are females. We have a couple of factories. Actually, this should be all the way at 1. I think there's a misreport because there are a couple of factories in the export processing zone that are entirely female. For the rest, you see most of them are crunched all the way over here on the left side. About 1 in 5 factories has 0 in our sample has 0 female supervisors. The median percentage of female supervisors is about 5%, just over 5%, so 1 in 20. So most of these factories that we're going to work with have almost no female supervisors at baseline when we start the project. So there's perhaps an under experimentation. It's also possible that if women don't expect to be promoted, that they don't invest in the skills that they need to be supervisors. About 20% of the operators are males. Our estimate is about 1 in 10 operators will become a supervisor. So roughly half the men will be supervisors. In our expectation is men enter the factory with the expectation that they're going to be supervisors, and they begin to acquire the skills they need to do so right away. There are also a set of explanations around comparative advantage. It may be that there are different skills, assertiveness, and other things that men are better as supervisors. Management tells us that they doubt women will remain in the labor force. They don't want to invest in the skills of women because women leave the labor force after they have children and so forth. And so that's why they don't promote women. And there may also be a bias against promoting women and a willingness to pay for that bias. So what are we going to do? Well, we partnered with GIZ, the German Overseas Aid Agency, to implement and evaluate a 6-week training program that was designed to train sewing machine operators to become line supervisors. In this phase, our project's been implemented in 2 phases. The first phase is what I'm going to talk about today. We've worked with about 60 factories, large factories with around 1,100 workers in the sewing section on average. We trained 4 women and 1 man in each of the factories. Overall, in this first phase, we've trained around 275 operators, most of them women. And the factories agree ex ante to try out, to give all of the trainees a trial as a supervisor. We don't ask them to commit to promote the women or to promote the trainees generally, because it may be the case that some of the trainees just don't work out. But we ask them to commit to giving a trial to the trainees, and I'll show you the data on that in a bit later. We're currently 2 months away from finishing the second phase of the project, which involves another 20 factories and another 150 trainees and so forth. We don't have data from that part of the project yet. Really, for us, in this project, training is a way to induce the factories to promote women. We're interested in comparing the female trainees. We'll be interested primarily in comparing the female trainees and the male trainees. And we see training as a mechanism to get the companies to promote women. So we want to think about So first here are some statistics of the factories, which have more or less already said. About 1,100 workers on average. These are very large factories. They have on average 19 production lines, and on average about 11% female supervisors. That's driven by the 2 very large factories that have mainly female supervisors. At the median, it's 5.6%. These are established factories that have, on average started in 1999, so 15 years ago. Production in the woven light knit sector of garments is organized on production lines. So this is a typical factory layout with a production line here, a production line there, and the supervisors are the people standing along the line, walking up and down the line, encouraging, making sure that work is happening, and so forth. You can think of this as inputs going in at one end of the line and the finished product coming out at the other. In fact, inputs will enter at different points along the line, but it's basically sequential production as we go along these production lines. This is the contents of the training over 36 days, over 6 weeks, roughly broken into production management, quality control, and then leadership and social compliance. So here, so we get a sample of males and females from the factories by asking the factories to give us, to start by giving us 8 women and 4 men. We do a simple, a short diagnostic, which includes a literacy test and numeracy test and some other diagnostics, and we then select the 2 best females and 2 of the next 4 females on the list and 1 of the top 2 males. And this is when we look at the pool of trainees, potential trainees that the factories provided to us. These are the characteristics of the men and women in those pools. We don't see huge differences, but we do see some significant differences. The men are slightly older. They're less likely to have children, and they have about a half year more schooling than the female trainees do. At the bottom, there's some scores on a scale of 1 to 4 of questions about overall job satisfaction, whether the pay is good, the job makes me learn new things, and things like that, and whether I'm treated with respect. And we see some differences, but again, not huge differences between the males and females. What do we know about how effective women are as supervisors? Well, I'm going to show you, I'll start by showing you this graph, which is we have in the baseline a few production lines where there are female supervisors. These are, of course, the female supervisors are completely endogenously placed by the factory, so they may be placed on different sorts of lines, but we do see lines where in the baseline data, lines that have female supervisors are slightly more efficient than lines that don't have female supervisors. Again, I take that with a grain of salt. The placements on the line are endogenous. There aren't very many female supervisors in the baseline, but that's the baseline data that we have. This, I think, was to us one of the more interesting data points that we got. We asked workers to compare male and female supervisors along a set of dimensions. So who is better at, we asked them generically, are men or women as supervisors better at resolving technical problems? Are men or women better at, are men or women more friendly as supervisors? Are men or women better at resolving conflicts? And this graph shows the proportion of the respondents who say the females are better. So one thing to point out is, the red line's the 50% line. Most of these categories, the workers say that females are better. But we've divided the sample into workers who tell us they've never worked for a female supervisor, and workers who tell us at some point they've worked for a female supervisor. And even though there are only about 10% female supervisors in the sample, workers move across lines with some frequency. So roughly half of the workers are in each of these groups. And notice that among those who've worked for female supervisors, they're systematically more likely to say that women are better than among those who have never had experience working with female supervisors. So there's an exposure issue here that I've always worked for male supervisors, so I tend to say male supervisors are better at everything when I have exposure. it's still the case that for most of these characteristics, the respondents say males are better, but the gaps are much lower than they are in the other part of the sample. Okay, so we do this training program, and what are the outcomes? So we have a baseline survey that we do just before the training. We go back to the factories about 4 months after training. We go back again 10 months after training. In the interest of time, I'm just going to show you the results, what we find at 10 months of training. So the first question that we're interested in is, do the trainees remain in the factory? One of the things the factories told us is, we don't want to pay for training like this because it's general skills. Workers will leave the factory. Women are especially likely to leave the factory, and therefore we especially don't want to train women. What do we find? Well, no, so what do we find? First, we find among males that those who receive training, which is the bottom bar, about 78% remain in the factory at 10 months. For females, it's about 70%. For those who weren't trained, it's about 70%. So, this still represents a fairly high exit rate. More than 1 in 5 leave the factory. But training has a positive effect on retention. Those who go to training are more likely to stay in the factory. And the same thing's true with women. Roughly, the numbers are the same, they're slightly lower. About 75% of the women with training are still in the factory. About 65 or 68% of the women without training. So, these are probably high enough that factories should be concerned that they provide training and that workers leave. There's a question when we think about the policy implications of this is if the training's effective, if it's important to get, if women are effective as supervisors, then perhaps this is not something the factory should do. It's something that the industry association should do, or perhaps the government. What about promotion rates? Well, at 10 months, about a quarter of the non-trainee males have been promoted. Around 80% of the male trainees have been promoted. About 55% of the women have been promoted. So there's a gap in promotion rates between men and women. On the other hand, this represents about 2 women per factory. And remember, most of these factories had about 2 women. The median factory had 2 women supervisors to begin with. So this represents a fairly large change in the number of women who are promoted. This is factory by factory, just to say there's a lot of variation across factories in promotion rates, which are the green bars as opposed to the yellow bars where workers are still working as operators. I'm going to skip this part. We then want to say, what can we say about how effective women are as supervisors? So we're going to do this in 2 different ways. We're going to, first, in the follow-up survey at 4 months, we conducted a management simulation exercise. We had pairs of operators led by a team leader who was a male trainee, a female trainee, or an existing supervisor. And we have them play production games that involve producing products made out of Legos or producing products made out of buttons. And then we look at the output of these production teams among males and females. And what do we find? We find first that the female trainees are have outputs from these simulation games which are much higher than the male trainees, about a third of the standard deviation. And we also find in the box here that the female leaders, team leaders, do especially well when the 2 operators are both women, and don't do so well when one of the operators is a man. There are almost none of the operator teams are two men, but there are a lot that are mixed, 1 male and 1 female, and the trainees do less well there. This is just a density of the same thing. After we've done the exercise works that the team of 2 operators plays the game twice, once with 1 team leader and once with a different team leader. We then ask them to compare those 2 team leaders in a set of characteristics. Who is better at answering questions? Who is better at correcting mistakes? Who is better at motivating, encouraging, and so forth? In every one of these cases, not significantly, but in every one of these cases, in spite of the fact that the production levels were higher when women were the team leaders, the operators say the men were better at answering questions, men were better at encouraging, motivating, and so forth. Next, we look at actual production data from the line. We're going to look at an efficiency measure, which is weighted by where it's output weighted by the complexity of the product. I'll just say it that way in the interest of time. And we'll also look at defect rates, absenteeism rates, and the length of time the production line operated. And here we actually find that the female supervisors look to do marginally worse than the male supervisors in terms of line efficiency, and their lines tend to operate slightly longer than the male trainees. Notice that we don't have a whole lot of production lines, especially for the males. When we have the second part of the data, we'll have significantly more information on this. But on the actual production data that we have, it looks like the males perform slightly better. Again, there's some densities. The last thing I want to say in the last 2 minutes we have left is I'll start with this slide actually. It's something, we pick up in a couple of different ways a sense of resistance against the female trainees. This is data from a question that we asked in the second phase of the project, but where we asked workers, do you prefer to work for male supervisors or female supervisors? Among the male workers we asked, 84% say they prefer to work for male supervisors. Only 6% prefer female. Among the females, it's roughly half-half. So even females slightly more likely to tell us they prefer to work for male supervisors, but it's roughly half-half. Big gender difference between the two workers. We conducted a game that we refer to as a cheating game. We gave workers and supervisors at different points in time a cup that was filled with red and green buttons. We said, pull out 5 buttons. Don't show them to us, but report to us how many green buttons and how many red buttons you pulled out. For each green button, you get to keep 20 taka, and for each red button, you'll give 20 taka to either another operator, a supervisor, and so forth. And so one thing we find is that we get a lot more green buttons than we should get. People keep money for themselves. In fact, we get 5.5 red buttons instead of 7.5 red buttons on average. We play this game three times. And it's the female trainees who are really the ones who are pulling out the green buttons. They're the ones who are cheating. And it's the female trainees, this is the amount received, so they're giving less to other supervisors, the female trainees, and they're receiving less from operators than other trainees. Okay, so again, we interpret some of this is sort of suggesting that there's some resistance. Yeah, I'm closing. So what have we done? We trained 4 women and 1 man. We find promotion rates which are higher for males than females. Females do a bit better in management simulation. Males seem to do a bit better in the actual production data. Some suggestion of resistance, and then we're still collecting data from the second phase of the project. We have a much more careful diagnostic of skills. We have better balance between males and females who are trained, so we'll have more statistical power in the comparison of males and females. And we've learned a lot over the last couple of years in measuring production data, so we'll have higher quality production data as well from the second phase. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Can I say from
Okay, let me. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation. I was thinking that, I'm also very much concerned about gender because I have 2 daughters, fortunately 1 wife. I'm the minority. I raise my voice, which is always shut down by them. You see, gender obviously is a very interesting subject as well as a matter of concern. However, I would like to give you the perspective rather than identifying what is their side. So, as you have pointed out in your presentation first, is that there are some other factors as well, where why female participation or female ratio is very low. So one, obviously, as I'm from Bangladesh, is a cultural issue. Right? To give you the example of even in the educated families, for instance, I can tell you about my own family. My wife is she holds a master's degree, but she is not willing to work because my father-in-law has always convinced her that it's better to take care of the family. So it is kind of like upbringings within the society, and that is kind of like pervasive in every sector. So that's why people don't even recognize that we are not even considering them. Maybe it's a common. The other is like information gap, that you are not aware that women can do better job. So once you show them, then you'll find that that is coming up or the situations are changing. Again, like in Bangladesh, how in the world, why gender, we have gender inequality, where all the big positions at this moment in Bangladesh are held by women, right? Again, status, family, background, this matters. Nobody even considers that, the Prime Minister is a woman because she is from a very influential family. So gender actually disappears there. But for a common person, gender becomes an issue. So this is what I think, you might be interested to look into more, since you have, plans to move forward with this experiment. Now, I also like to ask you, why do you think that training can change it? Why not, like, if I'm an employee, I'm not going to decide whether I'm going to be made, manager or not, right? So it is the decision of the management. So if you train me, and if the attitude of the management does not change, it is not going to make any difference, right? So this is something you might also be thinking. And then about the productivity change, I see that it's not a whole lot of change, right? There are some changes, but it's not a whole lot of change. Is it because that line supervisor is not a great a supervisory role? It is like doing the same kind of job, looking into someone and intervening. And it is and the pay. I think in your slide I saw that the pay is not differential is not very high. So is there any motivation to become a manager? Because you need to have some incentives that might lead to change your behavior as well as change your aspirations to become managers. And I think again from Bangladeshi perspective, I can say that as you have seen, the women, they are not preparing themselves actually. It's like 50-50 divide. It is sort of like inbuilt within the society. You'll find that in the family level, the enemy to especially we see in kind of like when you have mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, they become the enemy to each other. So it is if you go back to the because in the history of the culture, so again, this is kind of like education motivation that also needs to be taken care of. And if you are in the weak workforce, that gradually disappears. So since we are in the initial stage, okay,
we are out of time.
Fine. All right, then I stop here. Thank you very much.
Because I think your first point has covered this issue. So maybe right now we are not opening the floor.
Actually,
I want to.
people forget questions, you should let them take some first.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you might leave with their question.
But then we wanted to keep 15 minutes at the end
Oh,
to that thread.
Let me ask any question, Governments? Or we at the end actually?
Okay.
So actually thank both of the presenters actually. But regarding Professor Chris, am I right? Your presentation actually. So I find some problem in the findings. These are preliminary. So female trainees significantly outperform male trainees in post-training simulation exercise. And then you tell that there are no significant differences between male and female. Significant. With regard to line levels efficiency, quality defects, absenteeism. So then you say like that. So is it consistent?
So those are two different things. One is the simulation exercise, and the other is actual data from the production floor.
Yeah.
Okay, so we actually now do find some small differences even on the production floor. So in that sense, it's not that from that draft it's been rewritten a bit. So that on the production floor we found small differences, but still those are two different things. One is the simulation exercise, and the other is the simulation exercise we did because we're able there to observe much more carefully what the style of management of the two different supervisors is, and so that's why we're not able really to observe that on the factory floor. As soon as we show up, everything changes, and so we're not really able to observe that on the factory floor. All we can observe on the factory floor is the actual physical outcome, physical production.
Another point is that you're talking about the training.
Yeah.
Training area. So basically, and your hypothesis is that the gender imbalance in supervisory level actually, that whether that affects efficiency and productivity. So only one training as a very important variable, or the education background, the experience,
Right.
the household disease, a lot of factors.
No,
Right hand side variables.
sure, there are a
So
lot of
how
other.
much do you think that training can affect the productivity or efficiency? So, so we have to.
Let me answer that quickly in two parts. One is in this project we're not really going to be able to isolate training because the comparison that we can make is a trainee, it's the male trainee and the female trainee. Both of them have received training. We don't see the workers who didn't go to training, they don't get promoted. So we don't get to observe them as supervisors, and we can't see the effectiveness of training itself. We have a second project that we've done where we're taking existing line supervisors and we're giving them a version of the same training. And we're in the middle of that project as well. But that's to isolate the effects of the training on existing supervisors. In this project, because we were interested in, GIZ was interested in promotion of women, we couldn't take existing supervisors because there aren't enough female supervisors existing to be able to offer training to existing supervisors and look at differences between men and women. So we train operators, but then we have a hard time isolating the effect of training itself. So we have another project where we're going to do that, but we do think that's also a very important question. Does training have an effect on productivity of the supervisor?
Can I just ask each of the presenters to address just one big picture issue from each talk, just because I think that would be of general interest. So, and this actually came from from Dr. Ahmed's comments. One for Chris. So if really, there's some persistence of social norms about women's work or women's place in the household versus outside, right? Then why would training actually lead to a change in, getting women up to the manager level? Right, so why is this the right intervention? If you could just discuss that for a bit, and then I'll ask you.
Okay, so I would say I'll say two things about that. One is, again, I think we saw the training as a mechanism to get women promoted. I think we would have been happy if the factories had just said we're willing to promote some women without training, and we observed males and females. On the other hand, I would say that when I talk to our staff, and we haven't, I don't have a solid measure of this, but when I talk to our staff, when they interview the women at baseline, they say the women are very reserved, they won't look them in the eye, and after 6 weeks of training, that the leadership part of the training is I think by the factories and by our enumerators as well, seen as particularly valuable for women. That the assertiveness, the willingness to sort of take charge, the sense of being in control, partly because of cultural differences, and cultural attitudes of men and women is perhaps much more important for women than it is for men.
So cultural norms like this are quite universal, right? In many other IGC countries,
Yeah.
and broader than that. So is there any other evidence from anywhere else in the world that suggests that if you train women and expose them, and that itself raises their confidence and allows them to overcome?
I don't know. That's a good question.
That would be one way to motivate.
Yeah, can I add one more point? There is that, normally, the cooking part of the child rearing days are done by the women. So sometimes you'll find that even if there is an opportunity to grow, women are trying to avoid that because at the end of the day, they have to take care of the family.
But hang on. So most of the women in our sample have children, and they're still working in the factory. This is a different. I mean, in some senses, this is a group that the wages are extremely important. Most of the women in our sample, and the factories select that, and I think they select the women who already have children because they've already passed a hurdle where they think that the women are likely to exit. And the other thing I would say about this, and I think this is a big picture as well, is that if I look at observational data and I say women exit the factory, well, women have a top career path. They have a career path that's blocked. I don't know what happens when I have a career path that allows them to move into management. That may give me a very different, a different outcome on when women leave the factory.
That's right. And in any case, that itself is an outcome. It's a decision that the family has made, the society has made. It's not like women are born knowing how to cook and men are born unable to cook, right? So
some of the best, some of the chefs.
I think it does.
Sorry, I missed the early part of your presentation. The training is in leadership role.
So well, it covers it's 6 weeks. It covers production, sort of measurement of production, time, motion kinds of things, and line layouts and so forth. It covers quality control, and then it covers leadership and social compliance.
No,
so there's a component of it that's on leadership.
I was just trying to understand whether there was something in the training that made women much more confident after the 6-week exposure, or something else that came out. I don't know. You may want to speculate on that.
It's a related question, but who designed the training program, and was this the right kind of training program?
That's a good question, and that's part we want to find out, and what we're trying to find out in the second project. The training program is designed by GIZ in conjunction with a series of training facilities in Bangladesh, CFTM, OSALA, LCMI, and some others. So they worked jointly to develop the program a few years ago. But I think we are interested in whether this is the right kind of training and whether it works or not. And I think, again, that's really where the second project comes in, because we can isolate training more precisely. Jazz, that's a good question. There is a part that has to do with leadership. I suspect that's some of it. I suspect some of it is just having been selected for this and having confidence and having been, sort of pulled out and put into a group where the trainers are throughout the time trying to convince all of the trainees that their management material and that this is how they have to, how they have to deal with things, and there's an increase in knowledge from the training that's going to give people, generally, I think, more confidence as well. Would be my prior.
One minute comment. I mean, I'm not an expert in this field, but what I have seen in a factory owned by my elder brother, there is a social economic aspect of it. All the unemployed relatives of my family and all the influential people get referred to him, and he employs them as supervisor because these are all educated, university graduate, masters, remains unemployed. So whomever we refer, I mean, they ultimately end up in his factory as supervisor as opposed to, female. And we cannot ignore that dimension because in order to manage some of the even government processes and all this, he needs to accommodate all these kind of requests in his factory.
Yeah.
And he trains them to suit into the position. So his concentration is more in developing them rather than
So let's say this that on average these factories, these are line supervisors on the line. On average, they have 50 supervisors. Families are big, but maybe they're not quite that big. And many of these are part of groups where they have as many in our sample as some of the. So we have firms from some of the biggest groups, so they have 35, 50, as many as 50 factories. So they have 1,000 supervisors across all the factories. So we don't see university educated supervisors in the sample. At least the supervisors have on average 9 years of schooling. We may see a few universities. That's something that we'll look at because that's an interesting point. But I think that's not going to be what's driving this because I think that the numbers aren't going to be big enough.
Yeah. Let me just turn the conversation to Pinar for a second. Actually, it's kind of related on the training point. So just to recap for people who walked in later. So what was amazing about the results Pinar presented is that there was this big arsenic scare in Bangladesh. Right? There was an information campaign. So people are just told that these are clean wells, these are dirty wells. Right? They're not explicitly, mothers are not explicitly trained on exactly how to deal with it except to switch wells. But something she documented very clearly is that somehow on their own, mothers figure out that breastfeeding might be a way to protect children. And so they automatically, when they're exposed to more dirty wells, they automatically start breastfeeding their kids, right? Because less arsenic is then passed on and they protect them that way, indirectly, right? So that's what I find amazing about that. I mean, the fact that mothers do it by themselves is pretty extraordinary, but what I find amazing about that is that this comes against a backdrop of lots of interventions that the WHO, the UN, we all run, right? Like things like training programs to get people to do something differently, right? The training programs, training people to switch to a different water source, training people to, informing people about the dangers of the cook stoves that they use, switching to improved cook stoves, informing people about the benefits of using toilets rather than defecating in the open, right? And so we do all of this, and we do it explicitly, we spend a lot of money on it, and somehow we can't get behavior change. Behavior change is really, really difficult. It's very, very sticky, right? So what I wanted to hear from you, Pinar, is what are your thoughts on why is it that in this particular case mothers were doing this by themselves without being pushed so much, whereas against the backdrop of like a bunch of failures that we had in other sectors?
So I think there are two things that we
I
need to
think
consider.
no prior understanding of the effects of.
So actually that's number one. So one thing is that we contacted anyone who was ever involved in this particular project, and we have been told that nobody ever told the woman that if you breastfeed your kids, it will protect them from arsenic. So there is no conversation about that during this information campaign. But I think we shouldn't undermine the effect of previous breastfeeding campaigns and their efforts, combined with the women's putting those two things together. So if you think about it, this is a very scary thing. Someone is telling you that, look, this will make you cancer. And then previously people told you about breastfeeding. It was a kind of like blanket type of information campaign going on in the country. So initially they had very high actual breastfeeding levels compared to the world. So when we look at it actually, I didn't have time to talk about it. For instance, more educated women are actually more likely to change their behavior. So it can be the case that even though this particular campaign didn't talk about it, the previous knowledge about the benefits of breastfeeding is combined, and there's a huge literature about the cognitive understanding and education and kind of an education gradient for those information campaigns. So that is, I think, very important. The second thing is, I think the information campaigns, like we tell women to use, how to cook stuff, like in Bangladesh, you have research about that. We tell women to use certain contraceptive methods. But then we kind of ignore the part that there's a household burdening going on there. Like there are certain things that we assume once we tell women to do, they can easily do. For instance, when you look at the breastfeeding, that is a relatively personal decision, and again, we can look at actually the autonomy and how that affects female autonomy and how that's kind of a differential effect on breastfeeding. So I think that is another component about breastfeeding in particular. And I think for many other policy applications for campaign, people kind of underestimate that.
You're saying women can make the decision by themselves, so they do it, but when it's a household decision, it's harder to.
It's harder. So but I think any information campaign should be combined with maybe something else. So I think that is one potential research that is missing in the literature, except
I'm a bit confused on this particular finding because of the attribution. Because if you look into the 3 successive demographic and health survey of Bangladesh, in the last 2 months, the percentage of breastfeeding really jumped. And that's the period when, with all due respect, actually there hadn't been any campaign on arsenic. Because after 2007 and 8, no arsenic test ever took place in Bangladesh, except some projects like ours or BRAC, doing tests on their own. And no state mechanism is there to paint it red and green. The first round, which took place in 2003, after that it really didn't take place. Now, some organizations like Alive and Thrive, supported by first USAID and then Bill Gates, they would claim that the campaign that they undertook in the last 3-4 years on breastfeeding might have attribution or direct relationship with this sudden jump, which we are seeing in the last 2 DHS. On the other hand, why I'm saying that attribution is really problematic is if you look into the malnutrition status in the country, which is very much related with the hygienic practices, feeding practices, the malnutrition really remained plateaued over the last 3 DHS period, whereas if you look into the 3 successive multiple indicator cluster survey, the arsenic infested water actually getting reduced. So how we are attributing that mothers on their own, out of fear of arsenic, actually went to breastfeeding, or is it really the campaign or other factors? It would be very difficult to.
Right. So the data you just cited are the long run patterns on breastfeeding, the long run patterns on arsenic, etc. So, but that's not. She is not, with her results. She is not claiming that I can explain why breastfeeding is going up around the country. Right. What she can do is look at a given point in time, right, very carefully compare 2 different mothers. Right. One is taking a clean well, one is taking a dirty well, one is farther away from the clean option, one is closer to the clean option. Right? And at any given point in time, these 2 mothers are behaving differently based on whether they're arsenic exposed or not, and they behave differently in terms of the likelihood that they're breastfeeding their children for up to 6 months. Right? So this is a...
They can both be breastfeeding more or less compared to the previous periods.
Yeah. So it's a lot more fine-grained, detailed data than the aggregate.
Anybody wants to ask questions on that paper? Can't remember anything? Sorry about that, but I think, did you want to?
Oh, I think
you did.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Imagine that this had important health implications, that you could establish that.
Yeah. by the way, I believe that it does. It's just not been documented.
I'd like to think that it does.
Yeah.
And imagine that there was some cutoff point.
Yeah.
That if you have, I don't know whether there is, but
Yeah.
imagine that if you 5%. If you just have 5% open defecation, you're safe.
Okay.
The interesting question would be, what does it take to get to that 5%?
Right.
Okay, and what combination of demand, supply, and subsidy intervention will take you there, so that you get some idea of what it costs to reach that safe limit.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
so actually, there is this graph also tells you something. Okay? So notice that there is a significant difference between the 25% of people subsidized against 50 and 75, but there's actually no difference between 50 and 75. Right? So if you're going to subsidize, it turns out that these kind of network benefits that I'm saying through the interlinkages, as long as you get up to 50, you get them. Going from 50 to 75 is a waste of money. Of course, the extra 25 people that you're subsidizing, they'll be more likely to invest, but they're not going to be any more convincing to others. Right? So basically, from these three numbers, you already get some sense of exactly where that threshold is. But to identify it even more carefully, you might want to, between the 50 and 75, you want to play around with it a little bit more.
Maybe you could ask Chris to do a simulation.
So along the same lines as Dr. Naveed has said, so my focus is on a lot of health outcomes. Is building latrines more important, or is safe disposal of liquid waste?
Good, very good. So again, when you asked the question before about what are the health impacts, etc. So urban versus rural, the situation is totally different.
So for rural setup, like rural
Yeah. So in rural settings, Dr. Islam probably has some thoughts on it as well. My take is containment is very important, and especially the types of latrines we're using here. So we were actually doing the German car type latrines, not the Japanese car type latrines. Dual pit, offset, very deep in the ground, etc. Right? So what happens there is then, if you have dual pits, the feces get contained in one, and then you move to the other one, and it has a chance for the liquid and the solid to separate, right? And so there, as long as you're contained and it doesn't get into your water source, right, you're fine, and disposal is not a problem. Now in urban slums, I'm doing work in Kenya, so I'm doing toilets everywhere, and in Kenya it's very urban areas, and also in Bhubaneswar, city in India. There, the disposal is a big issue, because you need to, there's not enough space, right? And you need to have actually a daily or weekly mechanism to get the species out safely and turn it into fertilizer or do something with it. Right? And so this kind of fecal sludge management in urban areas is also a really, really huge issue. But I think for the rural areas, it's all about getting people to stop ODing.
The ultimate issue is polluting the surface water. So how you prevent those, and also spreading through the flies and all these vectors and everything. So containment is the philosophy, and that containment leads to the technology, what we call that. But can I just make one last point, because this is what I feel, I don't know, when we talk of menstrual hygiene management, when we talk of latrine and open defecation and all these issues, we want to rationalize our investment in terms of what outcome we derive out of health and all of this. But what we don't want to see is the dignity aspect of women, children, and all human beings. Can we really afford to let our women defecate in open at night?
Or our men?
I'm talking about in particular to arouse a kind of, a feeling of disgust that do you really let it happen? It's a rights issue. It's an issue of human dignity. So let's look at it from that angle as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
And they've done their own experiments where they set up
You can take it back to the desk actually, and they can maybe take it out.
and others that they have tried things out. Basic diagrams. But that is what I'm using work and forget it, so never again. And the whole you did, and at this point, we'll see when we get the second part, we'll have an additional set of factors. We don't have enough factors to be able to, there's too many possibilities to get by. How big the factor is, yes, this is great, fantastic, let's do So we don't have too many sort of variables given the number of factors that you have. Which training is
I think I saw in the paper, right? Yeah, and I think that's what this is about
So I think, you know, it is, to be honest,
you see, there's a great So it's actually that, to a certain degree, and this is again an open question, but to a certain degree, the factors are selecting. So we do find some evidence that when and in fact in the second phase, we have consistent that when the line supervisor that the selection was when it's in HR, they do the opposite. But they know, this would have been they were involved in the selection. So we're kind of relying on the factory to tell them, these are people we think are now. Partly, I think we get where you get seasonality in the factory. You go in a busy time, and she would be really good, but I have worked in your life for 6 months, so I'm not going to say, take somebody who's going out for that. To a certain extent, we don't have control over that. We have to kind of rely. But our answer to that is we rely on the factory. And we did find that some evidence that when that decision making it was better. And so the second phase,
I'm sure they're in touch with my staff.
At least one of them to make and then it's a training layer on top, and as I said,
we must just
तो मुझे नहीं लगे मैं तो बताया मैं टैक्सी में जाता था नहीं तो काम नहीं करता मैं इसीलिए क्या मुझे ईमेल नहीं मुझे तो गए जैसे ऐसे बताने को
I've got to run, but very good to see you, and I'll see you in November. Now.
I have many questions for you, but
Okay.
you are coming in.
I'm coming in November, so I'll see you then. Very nice to meet you. Yes, very good job.
Are you coming for NUDC?
I'm not actually, unfortunately, but
Okay, Chris.
I may see you in November as well.
Thank you very much.
He is definitely mine with me. That's
Well,
not good enough, Chris.
Yeah, because I have a conference there. I'm committed there, but I have to. We have to see whether the timing works.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I think I'll
But
be there.
Rocco
after.
was talking about that other issue, and maybe we can on the email talk about that. Looking at other aspects of the what you call supply chain.
Yeah. I think that's a good idea. My take on that is we meaning Teresa and Azam and Lavish need to have a bit more conversations with the quality control people in the factories and try to understand more what the quality is. That really an issue, and does it, where does it show up and things like
But
that.
secondly, I think just the procurement itself, a separate project on procurement side and the relationships and the chains that form and etc. would be
just mapping that
and seeing if that is an issue. Because we have found a lot of people saying quality is an issue of materials. So if that is an issue, where it is. Okay.
Good. Okay. Take care. Safe travels back.
Thank you, same to you. Can you check with Nisa if Nisa got the text?
तुमने निशा को भेजा?
I had
यार
her
कोई ईमेल
over-
कर दे इतनी बात क्या? तेरे पे फोन नहीं है? घर से कर दे. नहीं तो फिर मैं तो
Maybe
फोन
when my phone is...
No email on it, huh?
नहीं, it has email. I just...
Lazy.
I just forgot about it.
नहीं मैं कहती अभी नहीं अभी तो कोई नहीं तो तुमने किस वक्त बुक किया?
साढ़े
अच्छा तो वो एजाज भी साथ है उसको भी कहते हैं?
तो बिल्कुल
ओके तो ये ऑक्सफोर्ड सर्विस के पास ओके okay
I'll tell you I'll one way or another. Hang on, just do me one favor. Give me your phone. Let me see if I can catch Nipa.
उधर दिया तो कोई सिग्नल नहीं होगा ना?
That's
क्या कर नंबर पता नहीं Nipa का लंदन नंबर नहीं होगा तो ये Nipa तो है
Did she give you yesterday?
No.
Huh? She was किसको दे रही?
नहीं तो वहाँ का ऐसा तो दिया होगा वहाँ तुम बता दो तो मैं
3 days in a row, given that I've got back, went to sleep, got up, come back here again.
You know what makes you feel better? That's exactly what I've been doing.
Yeah, I know.
And I get home like at 10:30 when I go to sleep, and I wake up at 6 a.m. and I go to my job, and then I just come here in the tube, which is perfect.
I know, it's got central line.
Yeah, it's not very social.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's in a way that's the more annoying thing. I can't feel sorry for myself because you guys have been working all day, then coming here and then actually learning rather than just sort of organising internally and you guys are doing all this kind of stuff.
To be honest, yesterday I found it quite mentally refreshing.
Yeah.
But by 9, I think it's just because it's math. I come from a math background, but I was like,
Okay.
I'm quite tired now.
Yeah.
The logs and analysis, like I'm tired now. But
Yes, that's dangerous.
yeah, I think we just have to get used to it. So I thought I would come and revise all the stuff that I've kind of zoned out on.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, so I forgot to say earlier on in the emails and stuff, but what we're doing is we're adding the solutions to Moodle like the day after. So all of yesterday's stuff, the answers of this morning, and the answers from yesterday and today, like cumulatively, it'll increase. They'll be up tomorrow morning.
Okay. To be honest, I'll probably only get a chance to look at it on Saturday or maybe tomorrow night because I haven't really had any time to even do anything else.
Yeah, so that's a very fair point.
So I will definitely look at it. Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a revision, but it's amazing how much stuff you forget, even when you've done a lot of math in your life before.
Yeah, I guess I also like, I looked at my homework most of the day and they're all, that's fine. But obviously with the Scottish Independent Referendum, you know, like in second years, did quite a lot on delegation of powers.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're studying questions, I went through all that stuff, so I was talking around again, and then the read through,
Yeah, me too. Like I was thinking yesterday when I was going back on the bus, I was like, man, I've got all those log and Ellen rules, and I realized that was 20 years ago when I studied them in school.
20?
Yeah, 31. I was like, yeah, so I studied them when I was like 15 years old. I was like, you know what, now I feel better.
I thought you did that when you were 6.
No, I wish I was 6 now. I wish I was 26. Unfortunately, I'm in my 30s.
Prime of your life.
That's what everyone says. They say 30s the new 20s. So I like to think that's true.
You've got the perfect balance of knowing things, not being a stupid kid.
Yeah, and not being as broke as I was when I was a student, which is great.
I think everyone goes through that. I mean, it's nice to get through it.
I think so.
It's nice to put it aside. Over the last couple of years, it's kind of aside. And then like, I have money now.
Exactly. It's like,
nice places rather than.
So now I can actually put money in my student card and not have to starve.
Yeah.
Always good. Yeah.
I can have lunch at it too if I want.
I know. It's so cool. It doesn't have to be free for a change.
Oh god. You say that, so the views for like Harry Krishna vendor here, they're ridiculous. That's completely ridiculous. Obviously everyone's quite well off to pay what was it, £9 grand a year, and obviously you get a lot of international kids whose parents have a reputation and like pay a lot of money to be here.
Yeah. And still,
Free
right?
food, come on guys, Bright Spot, there's like £1.65 sandwiches.
That's so funny.
But the price varies depending on whether they're a good or not. Sometimes it's like £1.50.
Really?
Yeah, it's incredible.
It's interesting because like I work in financial sales, and literally I just have to give a client a pen, and they will do anything for me. And these are like bankers and Morgan Stanley. They're not exactly underpaid, and literally they're like, I need an umbrella today. And they're like, really? The umbrella costs like 10 quid. They're like, yeah, bring the umbrella, and then we'll have a meeting. It's like, okay, whatever you want, like cups and cash.
It's probably one of those umbrellas that you press a button and it extends and then goes out.
Yeah, they like those umbrellas. They're not very expensive.
Yeah.